We got a lot to talk about today. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about table saws. And if you're a beginner or anyone who's trying to upgrade their table saws, this might be a really good video for you to watch. Now, I asked you guys on Instagram if you guys have any questions about the table saw or any topics that I should cover, and 3D DIY Dave had a really good question. So I'm gonna go over the top 5 things that you should look for when you're buying a table saw. And I'll be using my table saw as an example, which is the Harvey Gold Top 2 horsepower table saw. And full disclaimer, Harvey did send me this table saw for an honest review, and I'm supposed to give them the video like long time ago, but I waited a full year for me to give you an honest review, and I'll be as honest as possible about this table saw. And you'll get a better idea on how this table saw is, and yeah. Now, when it comes to setting up the table saw, it's pretty similar for every single modern table saws out there. So I'm not even gonna bother covering that, and I'll just have a quick montage of me setting it up. And the shipping and delivery and packaging everything was smooth. And depending on what type of table saw you get, there's so many good setup videos and unboxing videos for these table saws. So make sure to check them out before you set it up. So when I asked you guys on Instagram, 3D DIY Dave had the perfect question that covers most of these questions, which is what are the top 5 things that you should look for when you're buying a table saw? And the top 5 things that I personally look for when I'm buying a table saw is this: sturdiness, power, defense, adjustment, and dust collection. Now, in the past 7 years, I pretty much had them all. I had the small job site saw from Ryobi. I had a small contractor saw from Ryobi, which was kind of old. And then I upgraded to a cast iron table saw, but it was like, 15, 20 years old. And I got it for like $100 on Craigslist. And then I upgraded to the 3 horsepower Grizzly from Chris from 4 Eyes Furniture. And then I had this one for about a year now. Now, first of all, the sturdiness. Your table saw needs to be rock solid when you're making a cut. What I noticed from job site saws is that it's very unstable. So unless you have a nice little base for it, it's gonna be uncomfortable for you. A lot of people just put it on a tabletop height, so it's like way up here, and sometimes they just put it on the floor, and when you're cutting, it starts moving and shifting. So that's very dangerous, and I don't recommend it. However, if you make a nice stable base for the job site saw, you could really get a lot out of that little job site saw. For example, Tamar from 3x3 Customs made the coolest things for the past several years just using a job site saw from DeWalt. So I'm just letting you know, it's completely possible to use a job site saw to make something really nice, and you just need to know how to use it. Now, personally, I break down a lot of full sheets of plywoods in my shop, and I designed the shop in a way that I'm capable of doing it easily, and that's why I prefer to have a cabinet-sized saw, which has a wider rip fence, which is, I think it comes 36 inches for the Harvey, but I had to cut it down, and so now I have it like 32 inches capacity. So it really depends on your preference, but it's really all about having it nice and stable so it doesn't rock back and forth and start moving on you when you're cutting large sheets of plywood. Now, here's what I actually don't like about this table saw. Because I have a small shop, I need this table saw to be mobile. And I attached the router table to the right side of the table saw so that I could double it as a router table as well as a table saw. Now, the original idea was for me to attach a cast iron router table to the right side of the table saw. But the balance of the table saw is kind of off. So the base is shifted so far to the left that it starts tilting the table saw to the right. And so even with my laminate top and a router lift and a bucket, that still weighs enough, so if I have a little nudge to it, it's gonna start tilting over. So to prevent that, I lean the table saw against the wall, but when I have it flipped over to use the router table, it tilts down. Now, to be fair, if I'm adding a cast iron router table, they include these legs with it, but without the router table, the table saw actually doesn't come with legs to support the right side of the table saw. And to be fair, most of you are going to have it in a fixed position so you don't have to worry about tilting over. And I even saw somebody make a really nice solid base that supports the right side of the table saw as well. But as a standard, it should be balanced already, or at least have some kind of support, adjustable support for the mobile base system as well as fixed position. That's fair, right? So when you're buying a table saw, try wiggling the table saw and try to test out how stable it's going to be while you're making your cuts. And depending on your materials, if you're cutting large sheet of plywood, then you want it to be more stable. And if you're cutting something small, then you can make a solid little base out of it for that little job site saw. Next, let's talk about power. When it comes to power, there's really few things to consider. First of all, let's talk about your options for your outlets. Now, most of you probably don't have a 220 volt outlet in your shop. And even if you do, you're probably using it for your washer and dryer, or maybe your electric vehicle, and every time you want to use a table saw, you got to switch it back and forth, and that's really going to drive you insane. So for most of you, you probably have only option to get the 110 volt table saws. So most of these brands are gonna give you that option, and same thing for the Harvey. This came pre-wired 115 volts. The plug looks a little different, but yeah, you could just use 110 volt outlets. And I could change the wiring so that I could use the 220 volt, and I could do that, but I didn't wanna keep switching back and forth because I only have one 220 volt, and I'm sharing that with the lathe and the bandsaw and the jointers. So I don't want to do it for the table saw, and I gotta wire it in a weird way so I don't walk over it all the time. So it's really nice to have 110 volt, and I don't really need that much. Another thing is, you need to ask yourself, what type of materials are you really cutting? Now, personally, I cut sheets of plywoods that are up to 1 inch thick, maybe, and a lot of skateboards. And occasionally I cut hardwoods that are maybe at most up to 2 inches thick, and I do it in multiple different passes. So for me, I really don't need that much power, and that's the reason why I went with the smaller 2 horsepower instead of, I think they even offer like 5 or 6 horsepower. So it really depends on what your needs are and what type of materials that you'll be cutting. If you're somebody who's making cutting boards out of hardwoods all the time and you need a lot of power, then obviously you should go for the higher horsepower table saws, but it really depends on what type of material you'll be cutting. So when it comes to power, think about how you're going to power your table saw, as well as what type of material you'll be cutting for the power that's needed out of your table saw. Next, let's talk about the fence, and I think this is probably the most important part of the table saw, in my opinion. Now, the biggest reason why you need a table saw is repeatability, because everything that you could do on the table saw, you could pretty much do with the circular saw. But let's say you want to cut 2-inch strips and you need 20 of them. Trying to do that with the circular saw is going to take forever, whereas with the table saw, you just set the fence at 2 inches and just keep feeding the wood through, and you'll do it in a matter of minutes. Now, what makes a good fence is the accuracy and the sturdiness of it when it's clamped down. And also, having a smooth fence is a plus. So I actually haven't done anything to this table saw to maintain it, and it's a little rusty, but when it's clamped down, it's rock solid. And you should always check the backside of the fence and see if it moves or not, because that's probably the most unsupported part of the fence, and you don't want this part to move while you're cutting. And this is one of the main reasons why I would stay away from the job site saw, because usually the fence is very flimsy and almost sketchy. Also, a good fence makes it easy for you to make the adjustments to make it square. Most premium table saws nowadays will have this T-style fence, and it's very easy to make the adjustments to get everything square. When I first received this table saw, the fence was extremely smooth, and it was really easy to make the adjustments to make it square. Now, one thing that I really don't like about this fence is the high and low fence feature. I never flipped it to the low setting the whole year that I had it. And I actually think it's an inconvenient feature because it's harder to clamp stuff to the fence, as well as make jigs that go over the fence so that I could rely on the fence, but very difficult, and I really don't understand why anybody would use the low feature, but yeah. So overall, I really like this Harvey table saws fence, and it's very sturdy, super easy to make the adjustments, and very smooth, but I don't understand the high and low fence system. So when it comes to the fence, check out how easy it is for you to make the adjustments to make it square, and check how sturdy it is when you have it clamped down so that it doesn't start moving on you when you're making a cut. Now, speaking of adjustments, next thing that you should look for is how easy is it for you to make adjustments to the table saw. How easy is it to raise the blade and lower the blade? How easy is it to change the blade? And how easy is it to change the angle of the blade? And these are type of operations that you'll be doing daily every single time you use the table saw, so it's very important. Now, these smaller job site saw will have these plastic wheels that are very small, so you have to kind of do this the whole time. Very flimsy too. I broke one of them. And when you go up to the premium cabinet saws, you're gonna have these big cast iron wheels, and Harvey's no different. They have this massive wheel that's really easy for me to turn, and same thing for the wheel that changes the angle of the blade. It's very easy to turn these wheels, and it's very smooth. Now, when it comes to the blade change, what I really don't like about this table saw is that you have to unscrew it to remove the plate. And I know it's like, what, 10 seconds of me just doing this, but still kind of annoying, right? I wish I could just take it out, put it back, but now that I think of it, I'm pretty sure that's for safety reasons so it doesn't kick back on your face. So maybe I'm wrong. Anyways, when it comes to the blade change, it's very simple. You just raise the blade all the way up as high as you can, and there's a little red button that you press to lock the blade, and you use this giant wrench to unscrew the nut, and there you have it. And I attached a magnet to this wrench so I could just keep it close by to the table saw, so whenever I had to make the adjustment, I could just use it. And taking off the riving knife and putting it back on is very easy and simple, and personally, I wouldn't remove it, and I highly recommend you never removing this, but I'll explain that a little later in this video. So when it comes to table saw adjustments, make sure to check out how easy is it going to be to raise and lower the blade, as well as change the angle and when you're changing the blade. And lastly, let's talk about dust collection. Now, when it comes to dust collection for your table saw, you have to have it. It's a must when you have a table saw. So when it comes to your budget, make sure to budget out a good dust collection for your table saw. And depending on how good your dust collection is, you could minimize a lot of dust that's coming out from your table saw. And table saws probably generate the most dust out of all these tools because you're going to be using it the most. Now, this Harvey table saw comes with this overarm dust extraction system, but personally, I think it's gonna get in the way more than anything, so I didn't even install it. Now, from my experience, this is what I could say about this Harvey table saw and its dust collection system. Depending on how good your dust collection is, this table saw could have amazing dust collection system, or if you have, standard wall-mounted dust collection, it's not gonna be that good. Let me explain. The design of this table saw's dust collection looks like this. You have this cover with a 2-inch hose that leads straight out. And this design, in theory, should work perfectly fine with the strong Harvey's dust collection system, because it's gonna just suck all that dust right out at the source where it's cutting. However, in my experience, it's just not enough sucking power out of this wall-mounted dust collection system. And from my experience, that little cover with the 2-inch hole gets jammed up. And when it gets jammed up, the dust starts collecting and starts stacking up and starts overflowing. In my previous video, you could clearly see the smoke coming off, and that's very dangerous. Now, to be fair, I never cleaned it because, I don't know, I thought it would naturally do it. I rarely check if it's getting clogged or not, so it's kind of my fault as well. But at the same time, the whole plate thing, I have to unscrew, and that kind of bothers me, so I don't do it. That's another thing. So yeah, to be fair, I should be cleaning it more often, but at the same time, it seems like this dust collection system design would work great for these dust collections that are very powerful, but for these smaller wall-mounted ones, I feel like it's kind of lacking. So it's really hard for me to give you an answer when it comes to this table saw's dust collection system. It really depends on the dust collection you have, as well as how frequently are you maintaining this table saw. Now, I'm sure if you're disciplined and you take care of your table saw and your tools in your shop, you're not gonna run into this problem. But for someone like me who's kind of careless and kind of treat this table saw like, yeah. So what do you think? Now, keep in mind, all table saws have terrible dust collection. It was the same for the Grizzly table saw. It's the same for the old contractor saws that I had. They all have terrible dust collection. And, it really depends on the dust collection system that you own. If you have one of those Harvey ones, which looks amazing, that thing looks like it sucks up dust like nothing, and it seems quiet. And I'm not trying to advertise this, but I'm just saying, it really depends on your dust collection. Now, overall, I really like this table saw, and I use it daily. I enjoy using it, and I have few problems with it, but it's not really a deal breaker for me. And if I spent just few amount of time to modify it or make it better for my personal use, I'm sure this will be 100%. But it just sucks that it doesn't come that way, and it makes sense. Every company can't, cater to one specific person. They're just catering to everybody, and they got to do the modification themselves. Okay, so I was editing this video and I realized I'm gonna spend a little bit of time to fix this table saw up, and I realized it was an easy fix. First of all, the stability issue, I realized this was tilting to the right only because of this cast iron right wing table. This thing is heavy, and I realized this is not standard, and this is an additional wing that I added that I forgot about. So, as a standard, this does not come with it. It'll be just a black laminate top, and the balance should be perfectly fine. Now, on the website, I saw this table with this cast iron top with no leg support on the right side, but they don't have the router table on it, so I'm sure it's perfectly stable, but at the same time, a little sketchy. So to solve that, for those of you who's not planning on leaning it against the wall, Rockler just came out with these foldable, adjustable leg supports for the outfeed table as well as the right wing table. I mean, you could use either of those and use that if you have to move it around. But for me, I realized I literally just attached a strip of plywood with this little strip of maple, and that solved the whole issue of being unstable and tilting over. I mean, look at this. This was all it took. Now, secondly, when it comes to the fence being super stiff, all you have to do is just wax this rail, and that's it. I mean, I don't know why I don't do these things. Look at this. It would have been so much easier. Now, one more thing. I realize my dust collection kind of sucks right now because I haven't changed that filter or cleaned it out in the last 3-4 years. So I'm going to get a new air filter and see how the dust collection goes, but it's totally my fault when it comes to the dust collection. I think this saw's more than capable of generating a good dust collection, but my dust collection right now is lacking. I don't know why I put it all the way up there, so I can't even clean the filter. So it's rare that I even, filter it out. It's completely my fault. This is a very nice table saw. I don't know why I was so mean about it. Maybe I was in a bad mood, huh? Now, the biggest question that I get when it comes to table saws is, why not get the saw stop? Nowadays, you can't even talk about table saws and not expect someone to bring up saw stop. The hot dogs, Now, I'm not hating on them, and my answer's always, if you have the money, buy the saw stop. And any way possible for you to be safe when you're woodworking is a plus. But usually this is what happens. They're gonna try to buy the saw stop, realize how expensive it is. So instead of getting the cabinet saw that they need, they buy this job site saw, and it's flimsy, you're not gonna get enough capacity, so you're kind of limited. And so that's one mistake that I always see other people making, is they're compromising because of the price and limiting themselves to a smaller table saw. And they're so worried about cutting their fingers, but in reality, the biggest dangers of operating a table saw is gonna be kickbacks. Now, there's many different ways for you to prevent kickbacks as well as cutting your fingers, and just to be honest, I cut my finger on a table saw probably the first couple months of doing woodworking. I wore gloves and I had a piece jammed in between the fence and the blade, and I tried to knock it over and the gloves got caught. Luckily, it was just a little scratch, but I could have lost my finger. So let me go over a few tips and tricks on how to operate this table saw safely and confidently, so you don't have to worry about getting your fingers cut or having a kickback. Let me actually switch over now to that view, because you should see this. Okay, so first of all, the most important thing for you to get a really safe cut is having your table saw aligned perfectly. Let me just go over this real quick. The blade needs to be perfectly parallel to these miter slots, and you could shift the table to align that. And then the blade also needs to be perfectly parallel with the fence. Now, just in case you can't get this fence perfectly parallel, you want to err more onto the side to the right. So when you're cutting something, you don't want to have it so that the material you're cutting is getting pinched between the blade and the fence. Got it? There's so many good videos out there on how to align your table saw, so make sure to watch it depending on the table saw that you have or will get. Now, speaking of pinching the material, next is going to be the riving knife. Especially when you're cutting hardwoods, the wood will start warping as you're cutting, and a lot of the times it starts pinching the back of the blade. And if you don't have the riving knife, it's gonna pinch the blade and kick back straight at you. So don't ever remove this riving knife, ever. Like, I never removed it. There's no reason for me to do it. It clears when I cut, and so I don't see the point of anybody removing the riving knife. So always keep it on. Next, make sure to have a clean and sharp blade. It doesn't matter if you have 5 horsepower table saw. If you have the wrong blade or a dull blade or a dirty blade, you're not gonna make a clean cut. And in my previous video, the table saw was gunked up and I didn't clean it for a while, so it started smoking a lot too, so it's potentially dangerous. And depending on the type of cut you're doing, whether it's rip cut or cross cut, there's different blades for it. So make sure to check out a couple videos that I'm going to link in the description to see which blade is the right one for you. Now, personally, I cut a lot of plywood, and skateboards are made out of plywood, or technically they are plywood. So I use this Ultimate Plywood by Freud or Diablo, and it's been working really great. So if you're cutting a lot of plywood, I recommend this blade. Next, raise the blade only about a 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch more than the material you'll be cutting. There is no reason for you to raise this blade up all the way when you're making a cut. You're probably gonna get a little bit cleaner cut, but there's so many other ways to achieve that, and you could just have a sacrificial block right behind it or get a cleaner blade. So there's really no reason for you to raise this blade up more than it needs to. So as long as you can see the gullet of the table saw, which is the little empty space, that's where the dust gets collected, and you want that dust to escape for the next cut. So that's how much you just want to raise it. It's usually about 3/8 of an inch, and so you don't have to raise it more than that. Now, the next thing is don't ever freehand on the table saw. Unless your name is Jimmy DeResta, don't even think about it. So freehanding is you just have the material and just cutting it like this. Don't do that. Please don't do that. And if you're Jimmy, do what you gotta do, baby. But for the rest of us, we're not Jimmy DeRestas. So when you're using a table saw, you need to either use the fence or the miter gauge or the sled. The fence is good for rip cuts, which is pretty much cutting strips like this with the grain. And the longer side always references to the fence. When you're doing cross cuts, which is this way, you want to use the miter gauge or the sled. The longer side always references to the miter gauge fence so that it's nice and stable. Now, most of the cuts that you'll be doing on the table saw will be either of these two. And if you want to cut it at certain angles, you could tilt the blade, or you could make a sled like this and have it at certain angles that you need. Now, here are some don't ever do's on the table saw. You shouldn't cross cut using a fence. Chances are it'll be unstable and unsupported after you finish the cut or during the cut. Next, you shouldn't do rip cuts using a miter gauge. Again, it'll be unstable and unsupported, and there's different ways to make this cut by using a tapering sled. Next, you can't use the miter gauge and the fence at the same time. Let's say I'm doing cross cuts and wanted to use the fence as a stop. What will happen is after I'm making the cut, the offcuts will be stuck between the blade and the fence and probably wobble a little bit and eventually catch one of the teeth of the blade and give you a kickback. So one way to avoid this is add a block or spacers at the beginning of the cut so that the offcut has room after it's finished cutting. The key point is you need to understand the beginning and till the end of a cut. And you need to make sure you have full control of the material that you're cutting from the beginning to the end. So if you're a beginner, lower the blade and practice the motion that you're going to make the cut. And if it feels sketchy, then think of some other ways to do it. But most likely, you'll know just by doing the motion, and you'll adjust how you're holding it, how you're securing the material. So that's a really good practice if you're a beginner. Now, last tip I want to give you is don't have your fingers inside of this little red plate here. So it's a good practice to keep your fingers away from the blade, and especially when you're using a sled. Let's say when you're using a sled, you could just kind of go back and forth and you don't have to worry about this moving side to side. Same thing with the miter gauge. You just have to worry about holding your material and just going up and down. So you just want to make sure your fingers are always away from the inside of this red plate. Red means stop, so stop putting your fingers in there. And another thing is, let's say you think you have full control and you have your finger very close to the blade and you're either coughing or sneezing or someone creeps up on you. So you don't want to like start jumping while you're making a cut. And so just keep your fingers as far away as possible. And you could secure these materials with a clamp. You could always clamp it down here. And especially when you're cutting smaller materials, make a sled and it's gonna be a whole lot safer and easier to make that cut. Now, one last tip. When your fence is very close to the blade, and let's say it's about 2 inches here, a lot of people are going to be using push sticks. And you don't wanna do this with just your thumb like this. It's just way too close and you don't want to be in the red either, right? So when you're using a push stick, don't use this type of push stick where you're just kind of grabbing it towards the end here. You have zero control and you're just pushing through and there's nothing holding the front down, so it's gonna pop up back at you. So what you want to do is use some type of push stick like this where you could actually press it downwards and push forwards. So you have better control of your material that you're cutting. And I'll have this push stick file available for free on my website because I care about people's safety, and I'll make it super easy so you could just print it out and cut it out if you don't have a CNC machine, or a digital file for CNC users out there. But I really like this type, super easy, full control, and yeah, don't ever raise the blade more than it needs to. You're far away from the blade, way safer than these little type of plastic push stick. I think I seen somebody recently get injured by this. So yeah, I'll link that video if I can find it. Now, let me end this video with the bang, the gold top finish. Now, personally, I really don't even care about the protective aspect of the gold top finish. I just really love the color of it. There's nobody else that has a gold top table saw out there on the market right now, and Harvey's the only one. I just love the color combination of gold and black, and it just looks so nice. Now, one thing that I'm kind of confused about is the different color or different shade of gold between this one and the main top here and this little side wing. I don't know why this color is more copperish, kind of dull color, and then this is like more shiny gold color. So kind of bothers me, but this is how it came. And when it comes to the protective aspect of this gold finish, it's not too bad. I had a lot of spills and glues and chips, and there's a little bit of surface rust going on, but I haven't even touched this ever since I got it and didn't do any cleanup whatsoever. And the fence, it used to be super smooth, but now it's kind of a little rough. But once I do a little bit of care, I think I'll end this video of me just cleaning up this table saw so I could work it back to its original glory, I guess. So I was cleaning up the top, and pretty much all I do is use WD-40 as a lubricant and start sanding it a little bit. I tried to go 320. Now, I started using the sander and I went the lowest speed, thank God, and I realized this takes off the gold. So I don't recommend you sanding it with any sandpaper. Just use a steel wool and just do it by hand and do it pretty lightly. The gold comes off pretty quick. If I were you, get one of these protective covers, these magnet sheets that go over the table saw, and have it protected as much as you can. Use paste wax, I don't know, once a week, or maybe even before you use it every day. It takes seconds or minutes. You're gonna get so much better quality saw out of your table saw if you maintain it. So yeah, that's one lesson I learned today, huh? Okay, so in conclusion, I actually really like this Harvey Gold Top 2 horsepower table saw. And I would actually recommend it to anybody who's looking to upgrade their table saw or trying to get a table saw. And this is a very premium cabinet style table saw. It's well worth the money, and I think you get a lot of value out of it. Now, there's few things that I wish it was better, but just a little bit of time to modify this table saw. I think I could get it to fit for my exact needs. And one more thing that I really didn't get to talk much about is this miter gauge. I think it comes with every table saw purchase. And this thing is the bee's knees, baby. This thing is really nice to use, very versatile, super accurate, and you could flip it over from this side to that side in a matter of seconds. And this stop here, you could make micro adjustments using this knob, and it's so convenient without having to shift over the whole thing. And I really like this miter gauge. And there's a lot of reviews on that, so make sure to check it out. But that miter gauge, bee's knees, baby. Okay, so that's it for this video. I know that was a lot to take in, but hopefully you have a rough idea on what to really look for when you're purchasing a brand new table saw. And if you're a beginner, make sure to check out some safety videos on how to safely operate on the table saw so you stay safe. If you haven't already, make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and comment down below any questions about the table saw, and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. Thanks again, and until next time.